Hey, how are you? I hope you're doing well. I'm going to be reading from the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning, 3rd edition. I'm on page 137, Cardiovascular Responses. Greater volumes of training affect heart rate. In at least one instance, the decreased resting heart rates were later followed by increased heart rates. Exercise induced maximum heart rates decrease from overtraining, as have heart rates at absolute submaximal exercise intensities. Increased volumes of training do not generally affect resting blood pressures. However, increased training intensities can produce increased resting diastolic blood pressures without affecting resting systolic pressures. Biochemical responses. High training volume results in increased levels of creatine kinase, indicating muscle damage. Lactate concentrations, on the other hand, either decrease or stay the same when training volumes increase. Blood lipids and lipoproteins are not altered by volume overtraining. Muscle glycogen decreases with prolonged periods of overtraining, although this may be largely due to dietary considerations. Decreased glycogen levels may contribute to lower lactate responses. Endocrine responses. In men, total testosterone decreases after initial increase in response to the exercise stimuli. Concentrations of free testosterone also decrease in some cases. These changes do not appear to be regulated by the pituitary, since luteinizing hormone levels are not affected. The changes in free testosterone appear to be independent of protein binding capacity because concentrations of sex hormone binding globulin are not altered. Therefore, the decreased ratio of total testosterone to sex hormone binding globulin that can accompany increased volumes of training seems to be due to altered total testosterone levels. Cortisol responses to increased volumes of training are variable. Specific responses appear to depend on several variables, including training protocol, diurnal variations, and whether resting or acute responses were measured. Increased cortisol concentrations have been associated with empirically identified overtraining syndromes and decreased aerobic performance. Pituitary regulation of adrenal cortex activity may be an important factor because decreased levels of adrenocorticotropin have resulted from overtraining protocols, although levels of this hormone may eventually increase. The anabolic-catabolic state of an organism may be quantified by the testosterone to cortisol ratio, which decreases or stays the same with greater training volumes. The free testosterone component may be more influential physiologically. Decreases of 5 to 50% in the ratio of free testosterone to cortisol have also been reported with increased training volumes. A possible marker of an overtraining syndrome is a decrease of 30% or more of this ratio. Decreased pituitary secretion of growth hormone occurs with overtraining. This and other endocrine responses to an overtraining stimulus appear to be due primarily to impaired hypothalamic function, not pituitary function. Whether these endocrine alterations are responsible for performance decrements is open to debate. Levels of free testosterone, total testosterone, cortisol, and creatine kinase seem to simply reflect training volumes. Actual physical performance is occasionally related to total testosterone concentrations, but not in all cases. Catecholamines appear very responsible in an overtraining stimulus. Alterations in basal levels of epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine are reported to be significantly related to the severity of self-reported complaints in overtrained runners. Changes in catecholamines and cortisol concentrations may mirror each other during overtraining, although cortisol is not as sensitive to increased training volumes as catecholamines are. Severely increased volumes of training can result in decreased nocturnal levels of epinephrine, which indicate basal levels. Pre-exercise or resting levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine are either unchanged or increased. The same absolute load of exercise results in increased epinephrine and norepinephrine levels in the presence of overtraining compared with before overtraining, although maximal levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine are unchanged. Basal levels of dopamine decrease with volume overtraining, as do dopamine concentrations at the same absolute workload. With submaximal exercise, dopamine responses vary, but appear to counter norepinephrine patterns. Although often difficult to document, severe volume overtraining or aerobic endurance athletes produce characteristics of the parasympathetic overtraining syndrome, including reduced sensitivity to catecholamines, and may result in advanced cases of severe overtraining syndrome. Detraining. If inactivity rather than proper recovery follows exercise, an athlete loses training adaptations that is, he or she experiences detraining. Little is known about detraining following various conditioning protocols. Aerobic endurance adaptations are most sensitive to periods of inactivity because of their enzymatic basis. The exact cellular mechanisms that dictate detraining changes are unknown. Further research is needed to clarify the underlying physiological alterations. It appears that when detraining occurs, the individual's physiological function reverts to a normal, untrained state. Proper exercise, variation, maintenance programs, and active recovery periods can adequately protect against serious detraining effects. Conclusion. Alright, this is a big deal. Aerobic exercise produces many acute cardiovascular and respiratory responses, and aerobic endurance training produces many chronic adaptations. This information can be of particular value for developing the goal of a conditioning program and can provide a basis for clinical evaluation and the selection of parameters included in such an evaluation process. Knowledge of cardiovascular, respiratory, nervous, muscular, bone, and connective tissue and endocrine system responses to aerobic endurance training can help the strength and conditioning professional understand the scientific basis for aerobic conditioning and the adaptations to expect and monitor during training. Adaptations to specific types of exercise stimuli take place in the body. Properly designing the workout protocol is vitally important to meeting the goal of the program. Optimal adaptations reflect careful design, implementation, and performance of strength and conditioning programs. Cool, so that was page 137, Cardiovascular Responses, Biochemical Responses, Endocrine Responses, Detraining, and the conclusion on page 139. See ya.